Hello and welcome to Season 12, Episode 14 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students. This time we're continuing our discussion of his really, really long chapter, kind of talking about the structure of the university here. This time talking about the next two sections within that chapter, the philosophic experience and then the Enlightenment transformation. So part of this bigger chapter from Socrates' apology to Heidegger's Rectoratsrede, just sort of tracing these sort of influential thinkers and what education is supposed to be. And this time, really talking a lot about Socrates in this first section, which I thought was an interesting discussion. I thought it was pretty good. But what did you think?
I enjoyed it. It's well written. I'm not sure why it's needed in this book.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for him to get to the point and get back to the subject matter.
Hmm.
Although he touches on it, but as far as this rationalism or whatever, he gets to it. But and then how philosophy plays in with society and all that kind of stuff. But it really is going down a rabbit hole.
Right.
It's a fascinating rabbit hole, but it's really kind of a description of the history of philosophy.
Right.
And I'm not sure that that's necessary for the topic. It's like a book within a book.
Yeah, it almost is. I mean, this whole chapter, it seems like, with how long it is and how
Yes.
extended it is, it reads a little bit like he was preparing this maybe for something different. I think
Yes.
it relates, and he's worked it in. I think that there are some insights here into, education and things like that. But it does seem very much like a longer discussion on a different topic
Yeah.
that thematically somewhat fits, but doesn't quite, fit the the main point of what the book is going for.
It reminds me like when I would be in a jury trial and we get sidetracked on some side issue and we'd have almost like a mini trial within a trial.
Right.
Like we'd want to get the information about this lesser issue established, and we're arguing taking all this time on this other issue when it kind of doesn't determine the outcome of the what the real trial is about, and even civil cases. And the judge will say, I'm not having a trial within this trial. We're having the trial. We're not
Right.
having the trial within the trial. You're not calling any more witnesses on this red herring defense or this other issue. And that's what I just feel like this entire chapter is. I mean, it's fascinating, and I like how he describes it. And we're going to go through it, of course.
Yeah. I think it is, the what he's trying to do, and I think it is interesting. I think it's a good point, is kind of building off of, the last section of this chapter, which was the connection between like philosophy and civil society, the connection between thought and civil society. He kind of uses Socrates as sort of like the founding example of this, of like how does a society respond to someone who wants to investigate these philosophical, sort of ideals and things like that. And what does a society do if they don't appreciate that? How necessary is a figure like Socrates to a civil society? So I think it is interesting. And he kind of does it by way of like contrasting, what Plato and Xenophon write about Socrates with Aristophanes,
Yes.
who satirizes him in the clouds. And I thought it was a really interesting discussion. But again, I don't know how much it relates to his overall point about the American education system.
Yeah. It could have been 3 pages. It was 25.
Yes, yes. It was interesting. It was fun to read, but I agree.
Yes. But I was like, why am I reading this other book?
Hmm. Within
I'm
this
reading
book.
I'm reading this book, not this other book. It's a good book. Maybe I'll read that sometime. Like I got 50 other books on my shelf. I don't need to read it. I don't really need to read a book within a book.
Right, right. Because he says, if we just want to start going through here, I think this
No,
is.
I want to talk about talking about it.
Yes, there we go. On 268, just like how you want to write a book within a book, you want to talk about this. You talk about talking about the book. But he says this rich drama of the early philosopher who came to the attention of the city because he was a philosopher presents all the questions of freedom of thought from all the angles without any kind of doctrinarism, and hence provides us with a fresh view of the importance and also of the difficulties of such freedom. From the Republic, which really takes seriously only the demands of knowledge, to the laws, which gives full attention to the competing demands of political life, Socrates, as perfecter and as dissolver of the community, reveals all the facets of his activity. So that's his sort of purpose here, is how does
Page you want?
Socrates,
Wait,
268,
what page?
269.
Mhm.
Yeah, did you just gloss over those pages?
No, I mean I had like two sentences underlined. You
Right.
read like 4 paragraphs. So I mean, you read a lot. I think we lost our listener. Our listener fell asleep.
Uh-huh.
So what's the point he was making with that
He's
three
essentially saying like
paragraph
Socrates
quote that you
in
read?
all of these different dialogues and these discussions and these plays, Socrates can kind of raise all of the important questions about freedom of thought, and how a civil society responds to it. And he says we can use him as a lens, to reveal what our society should and should not do, in terms of how we respect someone who's asking these important questions, what sort of freedoms we allow them. That is his point.
Yes. Okay. I agree with that.
But
Um,
then he continues on because then he talks about the clouds. I don't know if you've
yes.
ever read the clouds.
I
Um,
have read about the clouds, and I remember when I was first reading them, I did not know it was Aristophanes. I thought it was
yes.
Aristophanes.
Nope. It sure isn't.
I have to consciously
Hmm.
think Aristophanes.
Aristophanes, not Socrates and Socrates, not
And no, I
Aristotle.
never knew Socrates, but I'd never heard of Aristophanes before I read about Aristophanes.
Right.
Aristophanes.
Aristophanes, yeah.
So if you
Aristophanes.
read it, it looks like Aristophanes. Why wouldn't it be
Yes.
Aristophanes?
Because it's Greek. And in Greek you pronounce all the letters.
Yes, that's true. But yeah, so he makes fun of Socrates and what was the one? I love this. Uh, the Socrates of the cloud. This I'm in 269. The Socrates of the clouds is a man who despises what other people care about and cares about what they despise. He spends his life investigating nature, worrying about the gnats and stars, denying the existence of gods because they are not found in nature.
Hmm.
And I was reading, I think we mentioned before we started this, I just finished The Abolition of Man. And there's a lot of parallels in this chapter of the point of that book, which is like the more you try to take man out of the equation, the more you're actually, like as far as like God out of the equation, the more you're taking man out of the equation. I don't
Right.
know, that's probably not articulating right, but he's saying that like if you just relegate everything to scientific study, you find that the things you're really looking for are you're never going to find them in nature.
Right.
It's just natural. But anyway,
Right. Because
but then he goes on to. There's another quote that I thought was funny when he talks about the gnats.
well, I was going to say in that same paragraph, he says, law and convention mean nothing to him because they are not natural but man-made. His
Yeah,
companions are pale-faced young men, totally devoid of common sense. And he's kind of saying here, like this satire of Socrates is kind of what a lot of people do think about academics. And I think sometimes it's more accurate, especially now than it was back then, about caring about these things that nobody else cares about, teaching their students to think about useless things, not caring about the law or customs, and just sort of these weird abstract people who are sort of trying to shake up parts of society. I think that's very true in some cases. But he says, he says on 270, he says, what Aristophanes satirizes is the exterior of science, how the scientist appears to the non-scientist. He can only hint at the dignity of what the scientist does. It's just sort of satirizing this concept of the person who spends his whole life doing useless things, at least from the sort of common perspective. Are you
I'm
still
trying
looking
to
for this?
find. I'm trying to find the other quote.
You're just ignoring everything I just said.
I listened to what you said. I'm not prepared to respond to it.
Because you're too busy looking for this other quote. Is
I
it on
know.
the top of page 270?
Oh gosh, darn
The
it! Is
first
it?
paragraph of 270? I think I'm looking at the exact quote you wanted to mention.
I liked it. Uh,
First full paragraph of
Yeah,
270.
there it is. Yes. Aristophanes recaptures for us the absurdity of a grown man who spends his time thinking about gnats' anuses. And I bet you there is a scientific study somewhere in the world right now that somebody's got a grant to study gnats' anuses.
Yeah.
And I think that's the criticism, as you were just saying.
Mhm.
That's a criticism of some of these absurd topics in the university. Like absurd topics in philosophy, of course, too, but also with science. I mean, what's the value to it? And it's like there's that struggle between, what's the purpose of the university? Is it to just to think, to question these, make these big questions, or is it actually get answers to scientific study that actually has some meaning to somebody? some
Right.
sort of outcome to it, which I think is what you were just saying, was it
Yeah.
not?
No, you're right. Because he continues on where he says, if science is just for curiosity's sake, which is what theoretical men believe, it is nonsense and immoral nonsense from the viewpoint of practical men. So it's like if there's not a specific goal here, then it can be immoral. And I think he's making 2 points here. The one is what we're kind of saying, which is like that is all too common, where you do have people studying genuinely useless things. But I think the other side of it is not everything in education has a concrete practical purpose. And if you look
Yes.
at all of education from that lens, then it does seem ridiculous. But a lot of education needs to be for those non-practical things, these more idealistic, philosophical things. Because there's sort of two traps. Either you just go down the lens of, or go down the line of everything, studying only pointless things. You go too far down the side of study only practical things, and you need a mix of both.
Yes.
All
And,
right.
I'm just so happy that you also highlighted the quote that I did. You also highlight, or did you plan to discuss the quote that I wanted to talk about with the gnats?
I just noticed it. I figured that was one that you would bring up.
No, that's all right. I like that you're reading this with my voice in your head.
Yes, yeah, it's a problem.
You can hear me giggle. Dad's gonna laugh about that. I did like the shout out to Thales, although I don't know why it was mentioned. That he predicted the eclipse, but he's like, I guess, but anyway, he mentions Thales as he's known as the first Western philosopher, I think.
Yeah.
Predates Socrates, but I guess his point was that Thales was able to figure out through past observations, mathematical calculations, he was able to predict an eclipse. And so then because of that, that kind of scientific inquiry and that predictive outcome, and I'm at the top of page 271, he says Thales was seeing that the poetic or mythical accounts of eclipses are false. They are not, as men believed prior to the advent of science, a sign from the gods.
Hmm.
And so kind of demystifying, big sections of the universe. And so it necessarily, in some respects, limits the need or reduces the influence, I guess, maybe of religion in those kind of those topics, which we would consider like superstition. Um, but of course, the more you know about it, the opposite conclusion may come to the fore, which is this is so well designed, there
Hmm.
has to be some supernatural element to the
Right.
creator, which I think a lot of scientists that are really knowledgeable about these things kind of end up coming to that sort of conclusion, which you think is counterintuitive because like, well, it's all math and physics, but the more you know about the design, it becomes pretty obvious that there's some intentional
Yeah.
activity behind it.
Hmm. Because I like how he continues on because he uses Thales and he names a whole bunch of other philosophers
Yes,
and then going on to
yes,
272 he says like universities came to be where men were inspired by the philosophers' teachings and examples. Right? Because philosophy is really sort of this way of life that you live. You live as a philosopher. But then he says, I do not mean that philosophers were ordinarily present in universities any more than prophets or saints are ordinarily present in houses of worship.
yes,
But they're
yeah.
dedicated to those things, right? You're dedicated to learning from the philosophers, even though all the people who attend the university are not themselves philosophers. And he also says the philosophic life is not the university, right? It's
Mhm.
it's sort of beyond that. And so we sort of have this double problem that people go into the university expecting to become, a philosopher themselves. And then the other problem is that you are not adequately focusing on the right people when you go to or learning from the right people when you go to university. We've kind of phased all of these really important philosophers out, or a lot of them, at least, where you have to specifically be like a philosophy major if you want to learn any of these things. Right now, it's very much in that line of only the things that are immediately practically relevant to your specific subfield of a field, and that is the only thing that you learn.
Yeah.
You don't go beyond that.
And I really appreciated his analogy between the university and churches,
Mhm.
where he says in 272, I think you read
Right.
right before what I'm going to read. I don't think it overlaps, but but if he's talking about churches, but if the faith disappears, if the experiences reported by the prophets and saints become unbelievable or matters of indifference, the temple is no longer a temple, no matter how much activity of various kinds goes on in it. It gradually withers, and at best remains a monument, the inner life of which is alien to the tourists who pass idly through it. And I think that's just so true of churches.
Mm.
I call them the rainbow churches, where nobody actually believes in Christianity in these the churches, but they got, all these rainbow flags out front and trans stuff and all whatever.
Because you're seeing essentially
But
the
but
same.
but, but let me just finish my point, and then I want to dominate the conversation for another
Yes,
30
of
seconds.
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think it's true about the universities too. I never thought I didn't. I know I've always believed that about the churches, but I think that the same thing is true about the universities because they've become hollowed out. They don't believe in that scientific inquiry. They don't believe in the truth. Like there is an objective truth, or that there is beauty, or that there are values, the core values that just exist as natural. Like that we believe in justice and we believe in the search for truth and all that kind of stuff. And so now, like when we go to these beautiful universities, they are kind of like I'm a tourist. Oh, look, there's where it used to be a university, and now it's something else. Anyway, so
Yeah,
just
because
want to
they I was just going to say the same thing because they face like the same problem. They're both like fighting against the thing that they should stand for. I think even more concrete, like in the university, here in America, you're kind of part of this Western tradition, and a lot of these universities were specifically founded like we want to continue this line of thinking that has been passed down for since Socrates. But now, if you go to a lot of universities, even just the thought that there is a Western tradition to study is like a ridiculous concept, and you can only find small pockets of people in most universities who think that's even something that's worth studying or even is real.
yeah.
That's the same problem in these quote unquote churches, where you have these people who are like, oh, well, we're Christians, but actually we don't think Christ was real at all. Maybe he was an allegory for something, and really it's just about us. It reminds me of this. I was just seeing this clip earlier today of some just crazy church just having a Lady Gaga dance party where you have people
Hmm.
holding up segments of like the pride flag and dancing up in their, what would be a sanctuary in the Catholic Church. And they're dancing and it's, Lady Gaga's playing. And the funniest thing is like all of these people are like 70 plus, except
Ugh.
for the pastor who's like some sort of hippie looking, like, I don't know, mid-30s dude. And there's like I don't know, 2 dozen people in this church. And it's this beautiful old building, like I'm probably a Methodist church or something like that, not to just
Or
disparage all the
Episcopalian.
Methodists, yeah, or
Yeah.
Episcopalian, where it's nice looking building. But it's just you have like a couple dozen 75 plus year old people dancing around with pride flags and listening to Lady Gaga. And it's like that's where we're at this point.
And I've really come. I mean, I'm just going to say this for the benefit of our listener.
Hmm.
I've said it before, but there's something to just sitting quietly in a church and having somebody harangue you as a sinner and that you have failed
Hmm.
and that you need to repent.
Yeah.
There's just something about that uninterrupted 1 hour once a week. I mean, it should be more.
Hmm.
There's only so much I could take. Especially the children. But I'll go on a different rant about that some other time. It's gotten worse, Adam,
Mm,
a lot worse.
yeah.
But in any event, what was I saying? Anyway, so it's just, but you don't get that with this like this participatory, like we all have to agree, God, God needs our permission to
Right.
establish the moral terms. Like I have to approve it. I don't think that's how it works, especially in
Mhm.
Christianity. I mean, I guess you could have some sort of, non-Christian religion, but it's also the same about the university. I never really looked at them the same as I do now reading this book. So I think he was making such a really interesting point
Mhm.
that the failed Christian churches are very much like the failed universities. Of course, they're being destroyed by the same people.
Yeah. So I think it's the problem of whenever you lose sight of or purposely obscure what is like the end goal of
Yeah, or the
this
core
institution
purpose.
the core
Yeah,
purpose is you just
yeah,
lose everything about it. It reminds me, I was seeing this actually here in town today. I won't say which denomination this was because it's just that it's in town. I don't want to just specifically
sure.
identify this
Yeah.
one church, but I was seeing on the sign for this church, Jazz Eucharist, 11:30 on Sundays. And what that could possibly mean, I have I have absolutely zero idea. But that is a thing that this church does every week, I guess.
Hmm.
I
You
don't
know,
know.
I guess if they just have jazz themed music,
Hmm.
might not be bad. You know, like I like the symphony. Um, I think once a year they're in. It's not a Catholic church, but it's like an old cathedral.
Hmm.
They do. Is it Bach? It has a big religious
Hmm.
symphony or some sort of
Well, a lot of
performance.
those composers wrote like pieces for masses, like their
Correct.
whole work is specifically
Right.
structured around the mass. Yeah,
So I don't know. I'm gonna fall on the side of it might be okay. Maybe it's just
it could be.
but,
It could be.
just like like my favorite when I walk in that one Sunday a month and it's the what do they call that the hippie music one
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the word. I know praise and worship is kind of the catch-all term, but they have a specific phrase that they use.
what is it?
Um,
And it's okay, but it's
yeah,
so annoying.
yeah, I'm not a fan.
Call it uh, frickety frack.
It'll
But
come.
anyway. But but that's not blasphemous, and they mean so well. I mean, I know the people doing it.
Hmm. Right, right.
Uh,
Not like they're
and,
doing it, to
with
be.
one exception, they're all good people with good families. Talk about the exception later, but
Okay. Um, but yeah, then he continues on, right? Speaking of blasphemy, the
we're
basically,
making no progress with.
yes, I know we're going very slowly through this. I'll
Well,
move
we
on
can just
to
jet through the rest of it because we've made all the points,
that's true.
right?
Well, 275, right? Because then he
Yes,
says, here's what the actual charges against Socrates were, which were corrupting
yes,
the youth and impiety, with the implication that the latter is the deepest cause of the former, right? And so you have this attitude coming from the society that by sort of asking these questions, raising these problems, he is, attacking the gods essentially, and thereby attacking the structure of their whole society.
yes.
And so it's, I think people, I don't know how much people talk about, the trial and death of Socrates, but I think there is sometimes like an oversimplification of it as like, oh, those, stupid, superstitious, Greeks, they just didn't want anyone asking questions. And, maybe that was a part of it or whatever. But if you read, Plato's Apology, where he's, providing reasons for why he did these things, it's, clear that like the charges are no, you are like destabilizing to this entire society, right? And you are raising these things not for the purpose of just raising them, at least in the minds of the Athenians, but you're raising them for the purpose of trying to restructure the entire way we think about things, and that could be
Yes.
the downfall of our system. Which is true, writ large. If you have someone going around saying, well, actually, all of these things you believe in are false, and here are reasons why you should believe other things, your core principles don't matter, then yeah, I mean that is a serious problem.
Yeah, when I read it when I was about your age
Mhm.
the first time, or younger, I guess,
Mm.
um, I was 100% in that former category, which is all these people that are just trying to, destroy a true seeker. And now that I'm 55, I'm like, they had a point.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, it's
And
especially
he did. I always knew that he helped convict himself. He
oh
didn't
yeah.
really dispute the charges.
Mhm. He was just like, here's
He
why.
admitted the
Yeah, the
charges.
charges are right. It's just I have a problem with the fact that these charges exist, like as a
Yeah.
thing you can charge me with.
Yeah, and
You get the sense,
that's a dangerous game to play when you're
yeah,
on trial for a crime that can be punished by the death penalty.
right,
Well, I shouldn't be on trial. You
right.
have no right to even charge me with this crime, you bastards.
Yeah, you get the sense
Hang
because
'em. Hang 'em. They rise in unison.
in my last Greek
He was
class,
really kind of insulting to
yeah,
them,
oh yeah,
to the entire system. And he's like, I'm better than you.
right.
He kind of asked for it in a way.
Oh yeah, I mean, my last Greek class, we read the Apology in Greek, and it's kind of funny, almost how funny he is,
Yeah.
because you do get the sense that he's kind of sort of playing with them, and I think really the broader implications and the more, I don't want to say the more philosophical, but I guess the more serious discussions of like the nature of the state and who has the authority to condemn and stuff are in the dialogues following that, when he's in
Mm,
jail.
yes.
His friends are visiting, like, well, why don't you just escape? We have all of the means to. The guards would let you go, and he's like, well, no, it's just for me to follow the just orders of a
Right.
just government, right? And so that's where you get into the sort of the sense of what is the government for? Who is bound by the duty there?
Right.
But yeah, he says, Socrates collided not with culture, society, or economy, but with the law, which means with a political fact. The law is coercive. The human things impinge on the philosophers in the form of political demands. He says that's really the problem that Socrates was facing, is just specifically the coercive law there. And he wasn't too much colliding with necessarily the culture, but with just how the political economy was sort of set up there.
Yeah, and again, I think it's an interesting discussion. But how do you, he does try to tie this back into the discussion? But I'm wondering, where did he actually come to to tie it really solidly back in? I mean, he talks about like on 279. I think it's after he discusses all that stuff. He says he talks about the philosopher.
Mhm.
Like Socrates represents a philosopher. He says the philosopher wants to know things as they are. He loves the truth. That is an intellectual virtue. He does not love to tell the truth. That is a moral virtue. And he talks about how philosophers over the years have struggled with, their ability to seek the truth, but they seem to always be limited with actually telling the truth because of the power structure or whatever the case may be. He talks about like the aristocracy being able to, fund. It's essentially a leisure activity, which is to have
Right.
philosophers hanging about. Um, so he talks about how there's a value to it, but I don't think he doesn't really convince me that and I had a philosophy degree
Hmm.
that it's worth the trouble. I guess.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if he really articulates that, but
Right. Because I
yeah,
think, where he does, sort of get to it a little bit is more so like on 281, where he's saying, well, what is, philosophy's response? If the civil society is
yeah,
hostile, isn't supportive of it, he says it's an educational endeavor, rather more poetic or rhetorical than philosophic, the purpose of which is to temper the passions of gentlemen's souls, softening the hard passions such as anger and hardening the soft ones such as pity. And he sort of goes through this list of, all these people who were, essentially inspired through direct lineage by Socrates for this, where he says, it's this civilization constituting figure of, who do we define when we look at, sort of what is the ideal citizen, who is, sort of elucidating what are the values we need to talk about. And he says, there on 282, but it's, people, very few are actually ever convinced, right?
yeah,
It's really
right.
just this toleration of philosophy. And he says it requires its being thought to serve powerful elements in society without actually becoming their servant, right? So it's this weird balancing act you have to do if you want to have this sort of educational life. You have to convince people that it's important enough that you support us studying it, but not so critical that you sort of trying to control what it is that we are teaching. And I think that is the broader point that he's trying to bring into education, where he says, we
All
need
right.
the state to support education, but it needs enough independence, freedom of thought, that it's not just the state saying, here is exactly what you need to teach always.
Yeah, all right. Fair enough. I did like as he, and I highlighted some of the same things that you just quoted, so we're kind of on the same wavelength. But I like this quote 283 where he talks about how strong classical philosophy was.
Hmm.
It says classical philosophy was amazingly robust and survived changes as great as are imaginable, such as that from paganism to the revealed biblical religions. Marsilius of Padua was an Aristotelian, as was Aristotle, was as Aristotelian as Aristotle, proving that the problems are permanent, but their expressions are changing. We moderns think that a comparatively minor change like that wrought by the French Revolution, I don't know if I'd say it's minor, necessitates new thought. The ancients held that a man must never let himself be overcome by events, and it continues on there. But I agree with his point. It's like we think that all things are new, and that these ancient philosophers or the classical philosophers uh, weren't that good or weren't that bright. And
Right.
we've talked about that a few times. And reading a lot of actually because of this podcast, I've become I come to appreciate those medieval philosophers
Yeah.
a lot more than I ever did before.
Yeah.
Because like you hear about them a little bit or you read about them, but really there's such a focus in our educational system, even in study of philosophy on modern philosophers, is if everybody before them was just like pikers, oh, they just didn't know what they're talking about. Well, there's a lot of really good written thought, in those.
Yeah. Well, I know I was just mentioned to you before we started recording. We had a Thomistic Institute lecture here on campus with a professor, Dr. Michael Dauphiné from Ave Maria University, their theology department. And his lecture was specifically on the relevance of Thomas Aquinas to the modern day. And it's that exact point where it's like the problems we're facing are still the exact same. We're
Yeah.
not going through significantly different things, and especially not the significantly different event that was, the shift from, before Christ to after Christ, right? That's a much more significant change. And there you still have St. Thomas Aquinas using all of Aristotelian
Right.
philosophy, right? And that is sort of
Right.
the framework he's using and adapting it to the Christian worldview. These are still the same principles we ought to be working with. And if we just sort of throw those away, we're throwing away, thousands of years of all of this, scholarship and all of this intelligence that's been built up and based on these systems, just because it happened to not be written 100 years ago. Um,
Yeah.
Merely just the fact that we've had, a few centuries since a lot of the best thinkers there, we think that they're just not relevant anymore, which couldn't be farther from the truth.
Yes. That's one of the things I find really funny. I find a lot of things funny about the modern trans debate. But you hear him say, well, it's from, in ancient cultures, even ancient Greece, they had cross-dressing, we call transvestites or whatever. And but then they referenced that, which of course was mocked at times as a deviant behavior, and of course it was disruptive and all that, and ultimately rejected by those societies for many many years. And then, but then they also talk about how it's a modern concept, it's a new concept.
Right.
We haven't seen this before, and we've become more enlightened, and so now we know there's like 52 genders or whatever the hell
Right.
it is.
Right.
And so I find that really amusing.
Mhm.
They that they taught like the ancients. What was that? The Satyricon. Talked about
Yeah. Petronius's Satyricon.
Satyricon. That's an ancient. Is that Rome or Greek? Greek.
That's Roman. That's
That's
that's a
Roman.
Latin. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That was over 2,000 years ago, talking about people acting in that way, shall we say?
Right. And I mean, you can
Um,
almost kind of get that. I mean, you do get that, in the Greeks too, as well. I mean,
yes.
I've heard it commented before that you can read like Plato's Symposium, which is sort of his dialogue about love. We have all these men lounging around at the table at the symposium talking about love, and you can almost get the sense that there were no such thing as like heterosexual relationships in ancient Greece because they're always
Right.
talking about like these weird relationships between like the pederasty, where you had
Right.
the older
Right.
man and the younger boy, really. And it's like, well, that existed back then. And it's like, well, that doesn't automatically mean it's a good thing.
Right.
It would be good, just because it is good, not because it existed at this point in time or that point
Yes.
in time.
Yeah, because murder's been around for a long time too.
Right.
I think they might have mentioned in the Bible a couple times. But that's who was it? I read that many years ago because it was during the war in Afghanistan. Our troops had a real hard time because there was a lot of that pederasty
Right.
going on in the Afghan society,
Mhm.
or they call them dancing boys or whatever.
Right.
And because they were, tribal leaders would be doing this stuff, the U.S. soldiers were found it detestable and, of course, wanted to shoot people, and it caused a lot of problems.
Right.
And morale problems, all that kind of stuff. Like, we mean they're our allies, and they're doing this kid. That doesn't add up. But anyway, so back to the point,
Mhm.
is that one of the theories was the Greeks, when they were going through that area, actually may have started that as
Mhm.
as acceptable societal
Yeah, I've heard that too.
habit.
Yeah.
So that kind of blew my mind. That was many years ago. But anyway,
Well,
so
speaking of being more enlightened, that brings us to the other section we're talking about today, which is the Enlightenment transformation.
yes,
It's similar to what he's already kind of talked about a little bit through the book, but he does make an interesting connection because moving on from where the previous section ended, he was like, you have to sort of have this balancing act where you don't want to have too much influence in the society, but you want the society to support you as a philosopher. And he says, right at the beginning of 284 there in the Enlightenment transformation, he says, thinkers of the Enlightenment reproached all earlier philosophers for their powerlessness to help men in themselves. And he says,
Mhm.
you see this shift where now it's like we have to actively use these philosophical principles to improve the nature of man and to improve the nature of society. And we're going to solve all these problems and just have this switch in the terms of how you sort of think about human nature, where he says, knowledge is not in itself power, and though it is not in itself vulnerable to power, those who seek it and possess it most certainly are. Right? You
Mhm.
get this idea that knowledge is sort of this quantifiable thing that can help you to
Yes.
impact, political change or achieve power and things like that. He says that's sort of a shift that we're seeing in terms of what philosophy is thought to be.
Yes. That was like a PBS slogan, wasn't it? Or is it an NBC slogan?
Knowledge
NBC
is power.
was, yeah, knowledge is power. And then the more you know, with the little
Mm,
star going in the rainbow.
yes. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Or the rainbow was the gay thing. Um, well, it's what it is.
Yeah. True.
Yeah, and yeah, I hear it periodically. Rainbows are beautiful. Why do we let them co-opt that? Like, I don't know. Get back. This is where he finally segues, as far as my mind is concerned, into
Right.
something that really is going to be a commentary on the university system writ large, where he talks about that effort to change society through this philosophy, this knowledge-based system, the Enlightenment, where he says on 287, the scientists in this system belong to a world order of scientists, for national loyalties and customs are irrelevant to them as scientists. They are cosmopolitan, and I think that is a key weakness in the university system, is that they think that they're citizens of the world, um, and that they have a theory at the end of that paragraph. But the nations must all gradually become similar. Like,
Yeah.
they believe that we can just do away with nations or peoples and culture by trying to emphasize, the scientific discovery. And I think we really found that there's a serious limitation in the ability to do that, and the cultures they're just going to subsume them. I mean, we've seen that all over the place and in the world, and we're seeing cultures through migration coming into Europe and the United States and in North America, that are cultures that are really don't have that same
Right.
philosophy, but can benefit from the scientific inquiry. It's really, really fascinating.
Yeah. 'Cause I like what he says a little bit before that too, because he points to like Descartes and Hobbes here, as two examples. He says Descartes, proposes that the doctor is sort of one of these key. He sort of splits these into two different, types of scientists, where the doctor will essentially let us live long enough and heal all these ailments that we will replace, the priest. He says you'll gain men's attachment and disenchant the priest by having the superior doctor. Is that then Hobbes proposed that if another humble type, the policeman, who protects men against those who administer violent death, could be made effective in a new political order based on fear of violent death, et cetera, et cetera. Like you have these two types of scientists, right? The doctor who extends life and the policeman who protects you from all sorts of danger,
Right.
just marked by this sort of progress of science. And then we can have sort of this ideal society almost, and that's where you get this scientist who is beyond all sort of customs and all boundaries and things like that, so long as you are aimed at promoting longer life and freedom from all sorts of ailments.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. I mean, he goes on for several pages and really making that same point, I think. Um, yeah, I like how he concludes it. I don't know if you're ready for that, but at
Okay, yeah.
the end of it in 293, where he says they're demonstrably the result of the thought of a small group of men with deep insight in the nature of things, who collaborated in an enterprise, the success of which is almost beyond belief. It penetrated and informed every detail of life. These are not men to be dismissed, but they can be questioned.
Hmm.
And he's talking about, these philosophers and the Enlightenment, and there's a lot that they did well, and they're beneficial, but there are limitations on it, and they don't recognize or acknowledge those limitations. And I suspect that's where he's going to get into the next chapter, if
Right.
not the next section. But
I like to also, I won't pull up a specific quote in here, but in that chapter as well, he talks about, sort of the difference between rights and duties that we've had sort of come up. And now, sort of in this modern society, it's more about the rights that you were owed. And I think a large part of that, I was just finishing up an essay I'll be presenting on Tolkien and his political philosophies. This is kind of on my mind how it relates to his philosophy of language and stuff like that. Um,
good, the first Tolkien reference of
yes, there you
this
go.
episode.
Um,
Good.
because Bloom kind of says we have this idea that we're just owed these things from sort of a mysterious group of people, and I think he's really talking about these scientists. If we sort of perfect nature, well, of course they should owe us all of their advances. We don't really think about the duties that are owed in society anymore. And Tolkien makes this argument as well in the same letter. I think it's 1943. He's writing it, where he says he's either an anarchist or an unconstitutional monarchist, because both are opposed to this horrible like new. He calls it a theocracy, which is this horrible bureaucracy where you just don't really know who you're talking about at this point, who actually has the power. It's just them up there.
Mm.
These experts who, there's no room. I forget his exact wording. Essentially, there's no room for men to decide, what they want or to have what they want. Only what the experts think they ought to have. It's like this weird utilitarian blob that we've created. And I think it's that same thing where it's like we're just expecting this nameless group of scientists, beyond all borders, just to magically provide what is best for every single person because they're just the enlightened ones. They're beyond everybody there.
Yes.
Yeah, Tolkien's political thought is really interesting. He's only got
Yes.
a few letters where he specifically talks about it, and that's one of them. And then the other one's his really great letter that my paper's focusing on, which is his "All Leftists Are Anti-Philology" paper. It's really, really good. It's really short too, but it's really, really great.
I don't know why I find that funny. It's just kind of
Well,
interesting.
I think I make a good argument for why it's related, why his politics are related to philology. But
Well, to check out your paper after you present.
yes, there we go. There we go. Would you have any other final thoughts for this episode?
No,
All right. Well, then this has been season 12, episode 14 of Unlimited Opinions. I have been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop. I guess you didn't. I didn't ask you. Do you
No,
have
I
any?
didn't have any more thoughts. I think leaving it at Tolkien's is a good place to
Oh,
stop.
that's good.
Yep.
Yeah, excellent. I ruined it by asking you again. If I'll.
Oh, that's all right. I can always talk more about Tolkien. We can end again.
No, that's okay.
Well, you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD.